There's a break in the story of Joshua.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, Diego.
And so I didn't realize
everything
there was a break
over.
in the story of Joshua.
Yeah.
And so I read it like
You're out.
Yeah,
very, very Old Testament.
Yeah. You're definitely not the only one on that one. So the recording has started. We're doing Genesis 38. And as Katie just pointed out, yes, Genesis 38, story of Judah and Tamar. This is like a perfect example of story and chapter that seemingly comes out of nowhere. You were never taught about this in Sunday school. And most people don't know about it. And definitely the first time that you read it, it seems completely random, takes you out of the story, and very seemingly doesn't make sense. And quite honestly, I didn't know what I was really going to say about it because it is kind of a weird story. But oftentimes, the really weird chapters in the Bible are the things that most help us figure out how ancient people and how ancient Israelites understood themselves in the world, right? The weird ones, it's weird because it's weird to us. It probably wouldn't have been weird to the people at the time. And that's something that we should remember. Whenever we see something that's super weird, probably have the understanding of it probably wasn't that weird to the people at the time. And so what is it about it specifically that's weird to us is not weird to them. A major theme at this point in the story, because we just came from it and we talked about it last week, is which of the brothers is like the highest one, right? We've had this problem kind of from the beginning, Cain and Abel, right? All of these issues with brothers, but you now have, and especially from the implied reader, the reader at the time, which is going to be an ancient Israelite, either coming into the land right after the Exodus or post-Exodus, kind of around that time frame, about thinking, okay, which tribe, which family is like the one that's in charge, and that's like what they would be caring about, and that's what they would be thinking about at this point in time. And so these stories all play with those ideas. From the kingship standpoint, Judah, which this story is about, will eventually win that fight, right? The royal line is going to come from Judah. It's important to understand that. But I think that's enough that we'll start off and talk about this. I'll try and just talk about it chapter by or paragraph by paragraph.
Chapter 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Kezib when she bore him.
Okay, just a couple things on this first little section. Hira seems to be introduced just because he is one of the characters in the story. It's not clear, but there might be something going on with the fact that maybe the reason why Judah has all of these problems with these three particular sons might have to do with the fact that the mother is a Canaanite, right? And we've seen that with other places because like Esau took away from the Canaanites and all that stuff. And that seems to be a general thing about like, hey, this is going to bring about problems. Also that it happened at that time. So it happened at what time? Time around whenever they sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph was around 17 at that time. But there's also kind of a gap in time. So, we don't know fully whenever or exactly all this is happening. But it's interesting to me to think of that, well, at around roughly the time that Joseph is 17, Judah already has sons that are old enough to get married and then die. And so like the age difference there is significant. But also that makes sense because there's a potentially like roughly 20-year gap. Hey, roughly a 20-year gap where like Jacob is having all of his sons, right? So we'll keep going from there.
Well, the sons didn't necessarily die from old age though, because God like just kept killing them.
I never said that the sons died from old age.
Oh, I thought you were saying that.
I'm saying that Judah is old because he's old enough to have sons that get married and then die.
Oh, okay.
I'm not saying that they're dying of old age.
For his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house, till Shelah my son grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house.
Okay, so that's the first like really weird section to a modern audience, and we know nothing about that. So let's go through it slowly. So kind of the first thing is we don't know what did, right, that was wicked. It may have just been assumed that just because he died young, he did something wicked. We don't know what it is. Author doesn't know what it is, doesn't say. Doesn't really matter. It's mostly just setting up this very early idea of levirate marriage, which is what this is about. And so if you want to know more about what levirate marriage is, can someone go? Well, I actually have it, so I'll just read it. I don't know why I'm asking you guys to do it. So if you want to, you can flip to Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. So, and it talks about where the lever, which I thought was a funny word that I didn't even know exists, is allowed to refuse his obligation by participating in a public ceremony in which the widow shames him. So levirate marriage was a common practice at the time. It wasn't something that they just like made up. Other cultures had it. I think they have like some documents that showed that the Hittites had a version of it. And obviously what it is, it's when a brother dies without a son, it's the brother-in-law's duty to give or to have a wife with his previous wife, and then the child that's conceived takes on the name of the dead brother and is seen as coming from that dead brother. It's not seen as coming from them. But sometimes the brother that is the lever that would still have to do something to help raise that son until they were old enough to take care of them. And so a lot of times it would mean giving a portion of their own inheritance to that son, even though that son is not considered theirs. And so a lot of them wouldn't want to do it because of that. So in Deuteronomy, it says, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. So that take her to himself as wife. There's a lot of debate about what that would constitute, about whether or not they were actually like marrying her.
And that's what the Pharisees or whoever bring up Jesus said that one.
Yes, well, it's the Sadducees in that
Right,
case,
that's
but
because they don't believe.
because they don't believe
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the resurrection. But yes,
One time I decided not.
Not-
I was like, nah, I'm pretty sure those the Pharisees.
but yes, they're commenting on levirate marriage, and but to get back to this, it's not always clear. Like in Ruth, in the case of Ruth, because there's some form of levirate marriage that's going on there with Ruth and Boaz, right? And there's even like the relative that kind of like refuses it and everything. But in that case, he does take her as a wife, but that might just been because Boaz didn't have a wife. But it might be that if you do have a wife, that you just perform this duty, and then like the marriage is like temporary, that you're not like continuing.
Like a Godfather kind of rule.
Kind of something like that. It's not 100% clear on how that works.
But would that same mindset have existed several hundred years earlier with Onan?
Who knows?
All it says is just that he wasn't going to be his son.
He wasn't going to be his son, but
That's all it says.
that's
Does it mean more? You know?
but it might be it might like a lot of those ideas are implied about like ownership of son, right? Because we even had
don't know that reading this.
and so that's like a lot of the cultural baggage that's there that we miss because we have a totally different context of what it means to have someone be your son. But you can see it a little bit, like I said, that's where you see it with stuff that's strange. Like that's why whenever we talk about stuff with like Laban and all this stuff about him being like, these are my sons and daughters, and making a big fuss about it and like getting really angry over it, it seems to have some kind of like relationship between like ownership and like what they have and all this stuff, and bringing things and being a part of the clan and like and all of this, versus separating out and being different. That sort of thing mattered to people. And so like if and that's the other thing, is that it potentially there's a lot of argumentation that levirate marriage is a policy specifically designed actually to empower women. Like from our standpoint, we don't think that way at all, right? But it was often the case that if a woman was on her own, she would kind of lose a lot of the rights to like the property and everything that she had. And also she might not be able to, like, she might just not be able to physically defend it, right? Like that might be an issue. And so that's another area of where this might come in, of like, oh, you need to defend me long enough until my son is old enough to like defend me, kind of a thing. Like that was an aspect of it too. And so by giving them a son, it ensured that they were going to live. So they're in a very practical sense. But then there's another larger sense of having children means that you continue living. And it's connected to a lot of those ideas where we talk about, I guess I'm skipping in my notes a little bit here, but like that whole idea about so-and-so being cut off, right? That there's this idea of you continue to live and your identity continues to go forth through children. Like through children is a way in which you actually, there's an idea of defeating death actually through the process of having children. And that's where you get into stuff where it's like where Rachel says like, give me children lest I die. Like, okay, there's one sense in which she's being like over dramatic and like confrontation with Jacob, but then there's another sense in which if she doesn't have children, her line is going to be cut off. And we've already talked about this with like circumcision and other things, and there's routinely punishments that are given in the law of like, if so-and-so does this, you then cut them off. And it kind of means like you take them out of the community and you send them away. And it means that like their line kind of ends and is no longer a part of your community. Let me finish reading off the portion from Deuteronomy. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then the brother's wife shall go up to the gates of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. And the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then the brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In Israel, his name shall be called the house of whose sandal is removed. So there's like a ritualistic public shaming of a person that refuses to engage in levirate marriage. And the idea is that when you're doing this, you are not building up your brother. And so obviously there's this kind of further, right? This is the thing that like helps scholars figure out, okay, what does it mean to like build up his brother, like build up his brother's house? What does it mean to like have his name? This is where you relate. We've talked about this way long ago, but there's association with having a name and having renown and being well known, being well off, having high status. Having high status means you have a lot of money and stuff, right? Like all of those ideas are connected. Okay. Further on in that chapter, or that paragraph rather.
I do think it's interesting, just while we're still on
Yeah.
the topic, how when you click on Onan,
Yeah.
that Bible, his description is, he says, is slain by God for not fulfilling the Levitical requirement to so and so. And we'll hold on here.
Yeah. And so that's one of the things that's, because I've always had it in my head that it was that like the word levirate kind of, I mean, it has that same Levi like root in there, so that it was connected to the Levitical law. And obviously it's mentioned in like different portions of Leviticus. It's mentioned in a bunch of different places. So it does have a Levitical aspect to it. But as we can see here, this is happening before the establishment of that. And also we know now because of other sources that it was just a common practice at the time. So it seems to be kind of it might be that an intrinsic thing that became like codified in the Levitical law, which there's plenty of examples of that. You even have that with circumcision, right? Like circumcision was
Right, yeah,
it was
yeah,
a practice that happened elsewhere, but then gets codified in the Levitical law. You have plenty of instances of this, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why a lot of people are like, oh, the Bible is just copied and pasted from like other people, like other sources like beforehand, and other people were doing, but like that's only like a quarter to a half true. And it's
cultural things.
Right. And it's one
Not
of the things
like
where
a
it's like,
relation
oh,
to the
just
Bible.
because two cultures do like the same thing or do the same practice doesn't always mean that they're doing them for the same reasons. And it also, like, that explanation falls apart as soon as you start to look at the differences in things. we talked about this a lot whenever we talked about like Noah and the flood narratives, and everybody is always like, oh, the Hebrews just copied all of their flood narratives from like the people around them, and it's like it's probably actually not true, because like the Hebrew flood narratives are very different in very significant ways. I'm not going to go back and talk about all those, but like it's very significant in a lot of different ways. And so even the ways that like I might be making stuff up here because I haven't done like a deep study into Levitical like levirate marriage and like other like the surrounding ones, but my guess is that there's probably something different about the Hebrew form of levirate marriage versus the way that other people did it. And we know this from other things too, just like even with like slavery, like the way that the Israelites handled slavery, it was different than the way that people around them handled slavery. So just because they have an aspect of what the surrounding culture is doing doesn't mean that it's the exact same thing that the surrounding culture is doing. And oftentimes what the Israelites are trying to do is they're trying to take things and understandings from the other cultures that are around them and reorient them towards Yahweh and do them in a slightly different way, that they're like, this way is better and it's different and it's good, and so you should do it like this. And a lot of times we miss those because we don't live in that time frame and we don't know how Gentiles like at the time did different things. So we miss a lot of those things.
I just think it's kind of funny how the editors almost analyze by saying the Levitical requirements when obviously it's all that stuff.
Yeah. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, the other thing that I was going to say is pay really close attention here to what Judah does and says. There's this idea, because right, he says, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah grows up. For he feared that he would die like his brothers. And so there are some people that think that Judah might have even attributed the deaths of the brothers to Tamar. And apparently that's actually kind of a common like folktale trope in different things. Actually, Tobit, do you guys know what Tobit is? Tobit is it's a book of the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha are like, so like if you're Catholic, if Logan was here, he should know what the Apocrypha are. They're like all the extra books of the Bible that like people don't really like, Protestants don't read them or whatever. Tobit is one of those. And specifically it's an Old Testament book of Apocrypha. There are New Testament books as well. But in Tobit, one of the main plot elements is that Tobit is going on a journey to like meet this girl who she's had a problem where like all of her like husbands keep dying. And it ends up being that like there's like a demon like haunting her or whatever, and like they're and then like Tobit has like a guardian angel that like does something to like defeat the demon or whatever, and then they end up getting married and like all this stuff. Blah, blah, blah.
With the angel?
No, he marries the girl.
I must have zoned out.
Sorry, you missed some
That's
things.
fine. I laughed at Jeremy's joke for too long.
But sorry, but anyways, so the point might be that Judah might be falsely attributing that to Tamar, but Judah's sin in this story is going to be specifically tied to him not giving his son to Tamar. Let's keep going.
In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood.
Okay. So again, this is a weird thing to modern Christians. Like, we don't know what to make of this because it's like, who's the bad person and who's the good person in this story?
You guys don't have
And-
prostitutes at your church?
Yeah, and what exactly
You guys
like
don't go to prostitutes once you finish mourning over your dead wife.
and
Who
like
has gone unnamed in this story.
right. And so it's like there's a whole lot of like, is that wrong? Like, I don't know. It's not very
Seems mostly
clear.
stupid more than wrong.
Yeah, it seems more than right. It seems
Very
more
pitiful.
stupid, but it also it's so the big question to me is what Tamar is doing, is that wrong?
He's prostituting himself for a goat.
Well, so here's the
That
thing,
wasn't the intent.
and by the time you get to the end of
Something
it,
that's supposed to-
it actually seems that what Tamar is doing is actually kind of not wrong. Like, that's what the text says. Like, we're not there yet. Whenever we like, we'll talk about it a little bit, but it like, and so to me, so really, so to get back to this idea of like, why is this story here? To me, in my opinion, this story is really here because it is a story that is, well, one of the reasons why it's placed where it is because it's contrasting the story that's going to happen in the next chapter. So we'll go ahead and talk about that now, since you guys already know that story, right? Which is Potiphar, which is Joseph and Potiphar's house, right? And so he's from the last chapter.
You're kidding.
You should remember him. And so you have here a situation where, from the outside looking at the situation from a communal aspect, it would initially look like what Tamar is doing is the wrong thing. But by the time we get to the end of this chapter, she's actually going to be found to not be wrong and to kind of be right. And instead, her accuser, who's Judah in this case, is going to be the person that's wrong. And in the next chapter, we have a situation where you have an accuser, which in that case, it's a female accuser accusing a man of wrongdoing, and to the wider community, it looks like what he did was wrong, but actually what he did was right and correct. But in one of the situations, the situation gets resolved correctly the way that it should. And notice that it's in Israel. In Israel, the situation gets resolved correctly, and the innocent party is not punished. Whereas in Egypt, it's not resolved correctly, and Joseph is put into prison. In that being said, in both situations, the thing that the person did actually warrants death. In both situations, they should have been killed. But in both
The
of them, they're
wrongdoer?
no the wrongdoer. So Tamar in this situation, she's supposed to be killed, and Joseph for raping Potiphar's wife
Oh,
is
you mean
supposed to be
the
killed.
assumed wrong?
The assumed wrongdoing.
Okay.
Yes, the
Yeah.
assumed wrongdoing.
That's what.
But in one of them, she's vindicated, and the other one, he's not. And there's also an association about how in both of those stories, different items are used to establish guilt or innocence, right? In this case, it's going to be the signet, the cord, and the staff that prove Tamar's innocence, whereas in the other one, it's Joseph's coat that gets used to prove his guilt. And so you have these conflicting narratives about and fundamentally, in my opinion, what the story is doing there is actually undermining the way that ancient people thought of justice, because ancient people thought of justice primarily as a communal thing. This is one of the things that we just got done talking about how laws might be similar in one culture from the next. Like if you compare like the laws in the Code of Hammurabi versus like the Old Testament, a lot of them are similar, but the way that they are functioning is very fundamentally different. And one of the ways in which it's fundamentally different is that in a lot of the pagan cultures, they just cared about social order. And so because of that, it kind of didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was the social order. Was the social order maintained? If it was, then everything was good. This is why if stuff happened in secret and nobody really knew about it, you could let it slide and it wasn't that big of a deal. But in Israel, they're like, no, what actually happened, what the truth of the situation was, it matters to Yahweh, it matters to God, and ultimately God's going to work all of those things out and bring his justice, because he is a God of justice. He cares about those things. And it's not just the public perception of things. And so I think that's something that, again, is a thing that we don't think about because we're not living in that kind of context. But if you lived in like an Islamic culture or something like that, they very much still have those ideas. This is why honor killing is a big, it's a thing over there. It's why like honor killing. So it's when if your daughter does anything, and it kind of can be like anything to make it seem like her family isn't taking care of her, they can kill her. And so usually the way that this plays out is like it so like women always need chaperones. They can't. This is why women in Saudi Arabia are not allowed to drive. They're not allowed to drive by themselves. That they have to have a brother or a father, some male family relative with them pretty much at all times. They're not really allowed to leave the house anytime that they want to do this. They have to have a male with them, and so a lot of it involves like ideas about being promiscuous and having sex and all that stuff, and they're worried about that. But it also even just goes to working. Like you're not even allowed to like if you're a woman, you're not allowed to have your own job. Like you have to be dependent upon whatever like your brothers or the men of the household bring in. And if you go out and get a job on your own, they can kill you for that. And that falls under the category of honor killing. But even the being promiscuous idea, that even goes with the idea of, well, why are they being promiscuous? They're being promiscuous because they want a husband and want a different family because their family's not taking care of them. And so all of this is a way of bringing shame on their family. And like I said, it's very weird for Americans. We don't think like this at all, but it's the way that a lot of traditional cultures thought about things and perceived things. And it's like typical and normal. So it's important for us to remember that whenever we're reading stuff like this. And it's also one of the reasons why as Christians, as modern Christians, whenever we can like read the Bible and we start going, hey, what stuff do we do versus do we not do? Right? One of the rules that we can do is we can go, well, do we still have a lot of those same notions? No. Okay. We don't need modern Christians to perform levirate marriage. It's also one of the things that I find interesting that like all of these people that are very gung-ho about like following the law and everything, you don't see a lot of advocates out there for like levirate marriage and everything. Like I've heard no one ever argue for that in like modern times. But like it's part of the Levitical law. So yeah. The other thing that I wanted to point out is notice how this is literally an extreme version of child support and pro-life intuitions. Children are so important that if your sister-in-law doesn't have one, you have to help her get one, right? That's completely opposite of how we think about like abortion and like everything else. What?
It's a son, right?
Yes, and it's specifically a son.
But what if you have 6 daughters?
You keep going. It's a son. It's a son.
Small army.
Yeah, like that's what it is.
Apparently, also you just get some mistress involved too. When that's not enough of an option, you just keep going. Change it up.
Yeah, you keep going until like you get a son. So the other things that I wanted to talk about in this chapter or in this section, so part of the thing that I wanted to say here is that it might be the case that the reason why Tamar is doing this is precisely because notice, so where does it say? So it says that she did all of this stuff, for she saw that Shelah was grown up and she had not been given to him in marriage. She's going out there because she upheld her end of the bargain, right? The deal was you wait until Shelah is grown up and then you will be provided a son, right? And we just saw from Deuteronomy, the idea is she's owed a son, right? It's her, like she has a right to son, right? Because what did it say? Not perform the duty of the husband's brother to her, right? She has a right to a son. And so in her going out to like be prepared for that, she might be justified. Now, what's unclear is, does she recognize Judah? And so is the reason why she's willing to kind of prostitute herself because she recognizes Judah? I think the answer to that is no, because when she sends the stuff back to him, she says, the person that got me pregnant is the one who these belong to. Now, that could be her vaguely being passive aggressive, right? And just being
without directly accusing him. 'Cause I bet there's people around, and if she went, "You're the one that did this to me," that could make him mad and just kill her anyways.
Maybe, but well, it wouldn't have, yeah. But like, and so it's complicated there. So it's unclear as to like, whether or not she recognized him. It's also unclear this line about the covering of her face. He thought she was a prostitute for she had covered her face. did he think that she was a prostitute because she had her face covered, or did he think she was a prostitute just because he didn't recognize her and where she was standing, which
Maybe it
she
the
was
empty
standing
dress.
at the crossroads,
That was where they always hung out.
and so because that's where prostitutes hung out, that therefore, so to me it's unclear, and I haven't been able to find a definitive answer on that aspect of it. Probably.
I was glancing because just me, how I first going back to when how it says she in the ESV, which is what we've been reading, how it says, man, I lost it. How it says how she realized that she had not been given into marriage, and like when we first read it here in the ESV, to me it sounded just like, oh, she just now learned that he was finally of age.
Right.
But when I looked at NIV and NLT, they both went out of their way to communicate, oh no, this has been going on for a while. He was ready for a while.
Yes.
And then even more
And that is the implication. The implication is that he's been ready for a
and so
while,
I realized
and
that now.
Judah wasn't.
But when I
giving
looked at the
him-
NLT, they went out of their way for something else too. For verse 11, when it says, going back to how he thought that maybe Tamar was going to be the result of his third son dying.
Yes.
How the NLT goes out of the way to say, but Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Sheila would die too, like his other brothers. And so then it just kind of makes it seem like this version by saying that it makes it seem, all right, well, Judah was right for not giving her over because he thought he was doing it for the right reasons. Again, doesn't mean that it was okay.
Right.
Does it matter? I don't think it does. I think it matters more that maybe that was possible, and then maybe it's possible. Did you? While I was reading, I missed. Did you say that it's unclear if she recognized Judah?
It's unclear.
Because it doesn't say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just
you-
so many things that are unclear. That
yeah.
it's tough to really point a finger,
and
it's tough
and
to find a smoking gun.
and
on
it's
either side.
it's tough to find a motivation for a clear motivation, especially from her standpoint.
It's justified
But
on her part.
yeah, I mean,
Because
the more
I'm
He
not a
was
prostitute,
definitely
but I'll
doing
do
it
it for a joke.
like yeah, and that's what it seems to be. It seems to
I
be
mean, I
like,
have nothing because Judah abandoned me.
that's exactly
So I'll get something out of this.
exactly.
horrible
The more
thing.
that I think about it, and the more that I read it, it's she's actually really doing this out of desperation. And that's part of why it's like, oh, really what Judah did was really wrong. And that seems to be the thrust of the story, is what Judah's doing here is wrong. And it's almost even like a maybe tamer version of this would be whenever we think about like if an orphan steals a loaf of bread, are you going to cut off his hands, right? And like so like Nate is the pagan here in this story, and the Bible would condemn him, right? Like that's kind of
I
like
hate to be your
a
kid,
more
mate.
extreme version of that seems to be the lesson.
That's
For all time, just
I feel
Nate
bad
being
for
completely never be around orphans.
No sympathy for orphan children.
Yeah.
The ones that steal.
Walking Aladdin rooting for all the guards.
Get that string rat. But yeah, so I had the point that at the very least Tamar probably realized that he was a rich stranger, right? Also because apparently he does this with his friend just like there, which is weird.
You know, the problem I
This is
have
weird.
with that assumption is she married two of his sons. She has to at least know.
I
what her
know who
father-in-law
he
looks
is,
like.
yes.
So I find it
Well,
hard
also,
to
how-
believe that she had no clue who he was.
Yeah, it,
How
it
did
makes
she
more
receive-
sense to me that she does know
Yeah,
who he
it
is and
does.
what he looks like.
How did
Yes.
she receive the statement from him saying,
It was
"Hold on, wait till my third son gets older"? Like,
Well, he
I mean,
has
that
it-
was
it-
done directly.
servants.
It could be servants. It could be messengers.
Man, how
like-
rich is this guy that he
He
can't
doesn't even have to attend his own.
I don't even have to tell you about what we're gonna do about you marrying my third child.
Yeah.
Why my servant do it for me?
I mean,
He
Yeah.
doesn't handle
Yeah.
It
anything.
says in verse 6, Judah took a wife for Ernest, verse 1, and her name was Tamar. So That could mean he had someone take her for him. You know, we don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know fully.
It feels like, yes, the move to it seems like covering her face and going to this place does seem like she was intentionally trying to look and act as if she were a prostitute in the hopes of getting a son out of frustration from being owed one and being rejected it.
Well,
But it
and
also
actually,
feels
you know what?
targeted.
And even to correct what I was saying, because it does say specifically, and when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, that's whenever she goes out. And so,
She was trying to entrap him.
so
She's looking for him.
she's looking for him, or at least looking for Sheila. And like
That's
it's
true.
and so, but you then so there, but you also then have the idea of like, yeah, it seems much more likely that she knows what he looks like and that she did it on purpose.
And it seems more pointed, like it points the frustrations directly back at him. that,
Yes, because it's directed at him for what
like
he's
his
doing.
wrongdoing is what's on
Yes.
display here. If she doesn't know, and like it pulls it more full circle if she's aware of who he is.
All right, so let's keep going.
When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Oh, let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months.
That last sentence is weird.
Mine rephrases it and it says, "We'd be the laughing stock of the village if we went back again to look for her." So
I mean, that makes more sense.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, there's probably a better understanding of it, and that makes more sense. But in anyways, that seems to be the general idea of just being like, okay, we're gonna let this whole situation go.
Later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again.
So,
I feel like that last bit doesn't need to be stated.
No,
well, it kind of does.
if you ignore what that means, it sounds so much cooler. I did not know her again.
Oh, you mean like, and he forgot about her? That
Forgot
instant. But no.
As if to know is like something
Judah.
you do several times, which obviously, once you're talking about sex, is what it is.
Judah decides to be a total Chad and just say, "I forget about you."
Oh, I forgot. Who are you? again?
Yeah, who are you again?
Pulls a Thanos and
Your
then
daughter-in-law who gave you a son? Oh, right.
goes back and forgets about it.
But right, so so like I said, or I already mentioned this line, but like he says specifically, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her my son Sheila. Like that specifically is why she's vindicated, is because of his own sin and his own conviction for how he treated her. And also that you kind of have a nondescript, and part of the thing that communicates that she's being judged by the community is that you have a nondescript. Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral," right? It's not like a person is coming. It's just the community collective understanding is she had this child by immorality. And obviously she did, because you didn't send the son up here. And so in that sense, it's not just that she's immoral because he himself got her pregnant. It's also that she's being seen as immoral because you didn't send your son, right? Like if you had just sent your son, if you had just done this thing that everybody knows is the correct thing, she wouldn't have been judged by the community in this way, and she wouldn't be being brought out to be burned alive, which is awful. And that aspect of it, that punishment is actually more severe than, well, I'm gonna put quotes there, more severe than like, so the normal punishment for adultery is stoning, and a lot of people think that stoning is less severe because stoning is probably quicker.
Brimstone.
You get hit by a bunch of rocks and you get knocked out. You're on fire. You're on fire for a long time. It's awful. All right, last paragraph.
No, you didn't even talk about the part where I said that it probably didn't need to be stated that the line says, and he did not know her again, because, well, he only knew her or had sex with her in this case under a pretense of he didn't know who she was.
Right.
And so it kind of seems obvious that once he figured out who she was, he didn't go, let's run that back. let's do that.
Well,
again.
but I
I don't know
also,
why he wouldn't.
but I think it's,
My point.
but the further, but in my opinion, the reason why it says that line is because it doesn't want people, because Judah is, they're doing two things here in the story. They're one, highlighting Judah's sin, but they're also highlighting that Judah makes a just judgment, right? Like it is both painting Judah in a negative light and a good light at the same time, is what the story is doing. And so the reason why that line is in there, because it doesn't want people to get the idea that Judah took advantage of the situation and actually made Tamar his wife, and kept doing that. And because that aspect of it actually is against the Levitical law, right? And so if he were to further continue to have her as his wife, that would be against the Levitical law. And it's again, in cultures of that time, like, it could reasonably be assumed, right? Because we actually already had this, right, with the whole like Shechem and Dinah story, right? Once you have sex with somebody, like, oh, they're my wife now, right? Like, and you can kind of like make this assumption, but just, oh, but you want to formalize it? Okay, let's do a dowry. I'll give you a bunch of stuff, but like, we've had sex, so they're my wife now. And so a reader at the time could assume that, oh, Tamar's just his wife now. Sure, it came about through these like bad means or whatever, but that's what it is. And Judah's like, no, it stops here.
And that's honestly a great story to use for today. I mean, I just thought of
Oh,
the
yeah.
story, that story that you told, with a couple of us.
It happens a lot.
And it's like, well, just because it became out of something horrible, and so you don't want to do the wrong thing by going out, doesn't mean it's the wrong thing this time. Hold
Yeah,
on.
It doesn't mean that
This-
you continue doing the wrong
This union
thing.
was born out of sin, so why would you keep it in
And-
the name of good?
And also, like, again, like, honestly, the more that I think about this, I was like, this is a very anti-abortion passage,
Except for the
actually.
part where he tries to burn her alive with the baby in her.
Well, he didn't-
What?
He didn't know who she was.
Well, he's also not doing it. He doesn't kill it.
Yeah, but
he
they
just
I
wants to
mean,
burn her.
yeah. I mean, I suppose, but like, it is also the point that like
Well, they-
he well, and again, anti-abortion in as like close as this culture can get to that, because it is still very patriarchal and is still very much that like, if you do this wrong thing, like, they'll kill you. So like, it's working within the elements at the time. So yeah, again, this last paragraph.
When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah.
Isn't Perez the line of
It's line of David.
yeah?
Yeah. So that's the royal line. So again, like I said, this whole kind of this chapter, the chapter before it, like a lot of what they're talking about right now is like, what is the legitimate line? And you have the same kind of mini story here of brothers competing to be firstborn and all this stuff, and it's very quick, but you have that what would be the second brother, but you have another very quick instance of what would be the second brother becoming the first brother, and it's tied to Judah's sin, but like what is the overarching theme of Genesis itself, that just because somebody sins, God is going to find a way to renew it and restore it and use it for good and for accomplishing his plans. So I think that is basically everything that I had. Did anybody have any further comments, questions?
Do you think there's some sort of significance? It seems like every other person in Genesis is having twins.
Yeah. And because I think that, so like I said, there's a lot of things that Genesis borrows from its cultures at its time, but then there's a lot of things that it goes out of its way to undermine, right? And so, like I said, this story and the next story are very much undermining notions of communal justice and how that works in the ancient world. One of the other things that Genesis goes out of its way, because like I said, it's like, just read the whole thing through. It goes out of its way to undermine. It's called. It's like I'm just gonna call it like the primacy of, or the supremacy of the firstborn, right? Like it's such a major thing in the ancient world and in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is deliberately going out of its way to undermine that idea. And then, like, what your question is, why is it going out of its way to undermine that idea? In my opinion, the reason why it's going out of its way to undermine that idea, along with going out of its way to undermine a lot of these different ideas, is because it's trying to make it. The Bible is trying to make. It's trying to get people to. The whole thing that the Bible is trying to do is to try and get people to understand God, right? It's trying to get people to understand God, God's character, and more importantly, God's plan, and trying to get people to recognize that the common notions that the pagans around them have about God are not right. They are not correct. And this goes back to this idea of, if you remember in early Genesis, where I was talking about the idea of the people of the name being the people of greatness, renown, people that build up cities, people that have great technologies, people that make war and do all of this stuff. Like, those people are great, versus people of the name being of Hashem, of the Lord, or of Shem, the line, the Semitic people, being the people that live right and live correctly. It's making a moral case. That aspect of it gets lost on us in today's world because we fundamentally think that all religion is about morality. That was not the case in the ancient world. Most ancient religions had almost nothing to do with morality. I mean, go read some Greek mythology. Like, the gods didn't give a crap about morality. Like, and that's true for all of them. We only like this is where you get like all these atheists that are like, oh, all religions say to be good and be nice. Yeah, that's because of Christianity. Like,
You know, if you think about it, like those guys, like Zeus having sex with bulls and all that crap.
yeah,
If you think about like, you know, why do we have this innate sense to be good, you know, our laws and all this crap?
Yeah.
And it's like the one God that we know is trying to be this good that, like you're talking, that atheist will say,
yes,
is not Zeus, is not, you know, Apollo making these promises starting the Trojan War and all that crap. You know?
right.
It's not those ones. And that's just a really easy thought to come.
And when you do that, right, and because this gets back to like the thing that I'm trying to get people to understand is like how you live your life is fundamentally based on your theology, right? And so when you get that, when you understand that, no, actually, the center of like the universe and the God that makes everything work and that created everything and sustains everything, that ultimately he's good and he wants to be in a relationship with you and wants you to be good, that shifts everything. And it changes everything and it makes morality actually matter. Whereas this is why the ancient cultures cared about communal morality more than like what we would call like an objective morality, because they didn't care if you cheated on somebody. They didn't care if you had sex with your son's wife. Like, whatever. It just mattered if it upset the community. If it upset the community, then what happened were wars and fighting and people dying, and that's bad. And so because we don't want bad things, well, then we base our morality on what's bad. You see the same thing today, right? Like, it's, well, as long as we say that it's good and we're happy, well, then, like, that's what matters. It just matters about social cohesion. It doesn't matter, is it intrinsically good or is it intrinsically bad? Is it right or wrong? That doesn't matter. What matters is the like how the community feels about it, and our community feels attacked, and so therefore you're terrible. Like,
Nazi community.
yes, and so like, and that's the thing that's like in, I don't know how many books I've read at this point. Like, I don't know, it's not that many, 4 or 5 that all make the same book. That all they all make the same point, which is like the thing that is radically different about Judaism and about the Old Testament when comparing it to other texts and other pagan realms is the fact that, like, they have a God that's moral and that cares about that. Like, the others just didn't. And it's also important to realize that, like, it's through that goodness and that morality that's actually part of how God fulfills his promises to bless the nations, right? He's like, it's going to be through me that, like, and it's going to be through Israel, right? Because Israel is supposed to be a kingdom of priests, and people are going to be coming to Israel to learn about Yahweh. And like, well, why are they doing that? Why would anybody go to Israel to learn about Yahweh? Oh, because they're moral and they're good. And this is why you have all these psalms that are like, man, the law is great. Like, the Torah is fantastic. I love this thing, because they're comparing it to all of those around them. They're like, these people are whack. And that's the same reason why, like, and then what Christians end up doing is they end up taking that and like embodying that in Christ and going, we're going to take that to everywhere else. And guess what? Made a freaking big difference in the world. Like, well, America, we don't have we don't have gladiatorial battles anymore. Like slavery, by and large, like is gone numerically. Legal slavery is gone. Illegal slavery is still a thing. Also, depends on where you're talking about in the world, right? Like, I'm not going to name names about which countries have big problems with slavery. But like, yeah. So, but yeah. So that's how whenever I see that going on, where it's talking about, where it's trying to fundamentally undermine, it's called like prima pre-generation or something like that.
The status quo.
Yeah, there are certain elements of the status quo that it's fundamentally trying to undermine, and you see that actually throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, right? And you'll see this with like whatever, like people talk about, like, why does the Bible say that slavery is okay? Because slavery was like the most fundamental thing in like the ancient world. Trying to get rid of slavery is like incredibly hard. It's as difficult, like it's probably harder. It would be harder to get rid of. It would be harder to get rid of cars now than it would be to get rid of slavery then. And
easier.
Yes,
Yeah,
whatever.
I was like, based on your tone, your argument, I think you mean easier.
Yeah, sure, whatever. Like, yeah. It would be easier to get rid of cars now
Harder
than
to
it
get
would.
rid of slavery then.
Harder to get rid of slavery then. Yeah. Like it was that entrenched in the culture. But even then, Paul in the New Testament goes out of its way to try and upend slavery. And actually, even the Old Testament tries to go out of its way to upend slavery. Like,
Well, and
nobody else had years of Jubilee. Like, nobody else had that practice where you every 7 years you set your slaves free. Nobody had that. Now, that being said, there's a lot of argumentation about whether or not the Jews actually followed that. They probably didn't. But it's there, right? And it's like that with a lot of different things about like the way that they're trying to conduct themselves. Christians often so there's an idea of progressive revelation that over time God is able to reveal more and more about himself and about proper theology and about how the world should work. And he does that. One of the ways that he does that is through progressive revelation. And God is allowed to do that because God is a God that works through time. That's actually one of the other very big differences between Yahweh and other gods. Other gods don't work in time. Other gods did stuff way long ago, and mostly everything is settled, and they just do kind of whatever they want to do, and they'll interact here and there whenever they feel like it. And if you sacrifice enough, maybe you can get them to be like, oh, you know what, I really like you. You got the right stuff. And maybe, but most of them don't act in time, they don't have an ongoing plan of where they're trying to take the world and where they're trying to take humanity. Most of that is already settled. Really, it's Yahweh is like the unique one that's like, no, I'm working in time and I'm doing things and I'm making stuff happen. Anything else?
My question will probably spur on much less discussion. One, did they or were they able of knowing that someone was pregnant with twins beforehand? Two, how would they know that? Three,
I don't know.
You mean?
1A, because it's a follow-up question. But so two,
You do kind of a bop it thing and you count how many kicks.
two,
The first
Feel for the
ultrasound.
heads.
it does that mean that this specific midwife, just in case of if she was
She just
having
had
twins,
strings
just
ready.
had scarlet string, and wasn't just a practice to just go like, yep, you're first, congrats, and tie him up with LeBeau and be like, good job, buddy. Which in this case, tough luck, man. That backfired. When you think about the logistics of that, that
the
must have
second
sucked.
kid. They were
That
racing
whole
to get out there.
process.
Yeah, they're crawling.
The second
They're
kid was
crawling.
reaching around the head of the first.
Yeah, he had him in a chokehold and put his arm out there.
Well, I mean, they
Yeah, no.
really describe it, at least how they're viewing it, as like
Let me up,
the
let's
one
go.
baby trying to beat the other
Yes.
out of the womb.
Yeah.
And it's like, obviously, the babies, I'm sure, didn't have that mentality. They
No.
weren't like, oh, I want to surpass my brother because of this.
Well,
thing that's been
and-
happening through
But
generations."
and so this is also the point of why, like, a lot of
But
It's a very like mythologized.
Yeah,
version of
yeah,
it,
yeah, it's
'cause
kind
it
of
makes
a-
it,
it's
makes
kind
it
of-
more like they're named after like Smurf type conventions, or like have like attributes where like, okay, this is how they're gonna be described in life, so we're applying that to the circumstances of their birth.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It like this is why people will like attribute it as like legendary accounts, and you'll see like literary criticism where they'll like, okay, again, we're like all of these names are associated with like clans and all this stuff. So, okay, was there an actual birth with two individual people where they are competing in the womb? Maybe not. Maybe it was just two closely related clans or something that like were vying, and at one point they thought that this one was gonna be the leader, but then actually this one kind of took over and made a big thing, and it got recorded as this. You have a lot of like critical scholars that will do that sort of a thing. It gets messy quickly though. Whenever you, in my opinion, it gets messy quickly when you apply that sort of a hermeneutic to absolutely everything, because then every single person becomes a clan, and like everything becomes analogized about everything. And it becomes hard to be like, okay, like how when does that stop happening, right? Because I don't think David is a clan, and like I think David's having relations with the clan of like Bathsheba, right? It's like at a certain point, these people are like they're individuals, right? And so like it becomes hard. So a lot of times people will be like, well, it's just the stuff in Genesis. But then you have people that like are like, no, it's the stuff in Genesis and it's the whole Torah. It's like, okay. Well, then you have people that are like, well, it's the whole Torah and it's all of the stuff that's pre-exile. Well, David is pre-exile. And so you'll like for the longest time in biblical scholarship, they thought that David was a myth. They thought that David didn't exist. And it wasn't until they actually had archaeological evidence that they actually found David's palace near like the Temple Mount, which is like kind of where like they said it would be at, or where the Bible said it would be at, where they were like, oh, David's an actual person. And so then what ends up happening is, well, then all of those people that kind of thought all the individual peoples are actually clan names and blah, 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 and it's all, they push those dates back. Well, actually, one of the things that just happened recently is they, so like the biggest deal is that they found a curse tablet on Mount Ebal, which, so there's an account in the book of Joshua where they come into the land and they set up two altars, one on the Mount of Cursing and one on the Mount of Blessing. And they're like two mounts that are like next to each other. And so on one, they do a bunch of blessings, and on the other one, they do a bunch of curses. Well, on the Mount of Curses, Mount Ebal, they know where that's at. They've done a bunch of archaeological digs, and they very recently, like when I say recently, I mean like past month or two, like this like news came out that they found the curse tablet back in 2019. But they made the press conference and everything, and it made news and headlines and everything within like the past month or two. Where they found this curse tablet, and on the curse tablet is written the name of Yahweh. Part of the reason why people
or something, because couldn't they not? No, they couldn't write down the whole name. Isn't that what it was?
well, they don't do vowel markings.
But that was just in general, though.
In general, they didn't do vowel markings. It wasn't specifically on
I
that.
remember learning something about that, but it was wrong, and that made me want
we can talk about that. There's a whole like stuff about vowel markings and
Go on,
everything.
this is-
But part of the reason why that's very significant is also because a lot of these same literary scholars and critical scholars that do this translation relationship between person names and clan names and trying to say like well, it's clans vying for control and like all of this stuff. They also subscribe to, it's very popular, it's called the documentary hypothesis, and that's where I've mentioned before, like the it's JEDP, whatever hypothesis, where the Torah is written by a bunch of different authors, and it's this conglomeration of all these different works by all these different people and put together. And there's some loose evidence for it, and I kind of see it, but to me, it just seems like it's probably just an editor going in. We've talked about editor scribal notes and different things and all this stuff. Part of the reason why that theory is popular is because it used to be believed that the Hebrews couldn't even write until the post-exilic period, until after the exile. It used to be believed that they learned writing in Babylon. And so, right, there's the exile to Babylon. A bunch of them become scholars and all this stuff. This is what like the account of Daniel is, and they come back. And then afterwards, they have a bunch of awesome scholars that are writing all of this stuff. This is what a bunch of people used to think. Due to the dating on this curse tablet, they now have in the land of Israel writing, and a portion of that writing has the divine name Yahweh on it. So it's like, okay, we now have people in the right place at the right, evidence of people in the right place at the right time, worshiping the right God that our text says that they would be doing. And so that shows that if they had enough writing to write this curse tablet, they conceivably had enough writing to write the whole Torah. Like, they probably could have. And so even if you want to say that it got edited by somebody else, by other scribes later down the road, which I think happened and think is reasonable, it's pretty good evidence for Mosaic authorship and that actually happened. And so as soon as you get to that point of where you're like, okay, people even closer to the time are the ones that are writing this, it's less likely that it's legendary oral accounts of tribes arguing with each other. And at some point, it's more likely that it were just people. Now, even if they were just people, does that mean that the account as written isn't a legendary account? And that, well, actually, they were just two brothers that this scribe, Moses never met these guys, right? Let's just be honest. Moses never met these two individuals. So, and everybody puts the earliest possible author is maybe Moses. Maybe he has an earlier source that he's getting things from. But he didn't know these. It's entirely plausible that Moses is making this up. Is him making it up divinely inspired? Sure. Why is he putting it in there? For all of those theological reasons that I just talked about earlier. So, like, for me, I don't need there to be like an actual instance of two twins trying to race crawl out of their mother's womb. I don't need that to have actually have happened. Like, for me, it's enough that
Moses was had a great relationship with God, and we can trust what he wrote.
And trust what he wrote, and trust that the ideas that Moses is trying to communicate through this story and through the wider story that he's telling, that those are true stories and that matter to us today. And to me,
it's important that it was written whether or not it was like
literally what happened, that there were babies trying to crawl out their mother's womb. I don't need that to have actually happened. Like, that's okay. That can, and this is what gets chalked up to literal or literary artistry. The person that's writing the story is allowed to write it in a way
that
that's
probably
like,
was that the babies just were all messed up and getting pushed out, and they just interpreted it as
they're fighting for control, right?
Well,
but it's obvious that they're fighting for control. Is their fighting of control in the womb is clearly meant to be a symbol for them
Right.
fighting for
Which-
control of like of the
Sure.
of the covenantal line
Right.
and
and-
of the really the royal line
And that's
to the
why
Jews
they-
at the time that read.
Which is why
That's
it's,
what they
it's
care
less about like that, like a physical event happened, and it is more about that. This is, it's a symbolic shorthand for describing events in their life, which is why I made it the comparison to Smurfs because it's saying okay, an incident happened at their birth that characterized their life, and it's that interpretation of it. Whether or not they literally had like an event that happened where a midwife grabbed a piece of string and like tied it around her hand, like that happened, is besides the point. It's demonstrating, okay, this is a microcosm of what their actual life looked like, and so we're just gonna throw it in there to describe that.
All right. Anything else? We went for a long time.
Speaking of very important recent news, did you guys hear that Big Time Rush is back together?
I'm stopping the recording.